So welcome, Charles Jamieson. I'm so happy to have you here on the podcast, and thank you for being my guest today.
It's my great pleasure to be here giving a presentation today. Thank you.
Yeah, I was really happy to be introduced to you and to realize that you had such a deep experience in something that I have not covered in my, I don't know, maybe it's 3 years now of doing this podcast. And that is the topic of false allegations, which is something that if there could be anything worse than parental alienation, I think it's probably false allegations. And as you said to me just a moment ago before I started recording, those things often go hand in hand, sadly. But we're going to talk specifically today about some tips that you have for dads who may be facing the specter of false allegations regarding child abuse, potentially sexual abuse, emotional abuse, whatever it might be. Certainly, I think the sexual abuse is probably the really hot topic or the hot button of danger zone in terms of what could put you into an absolute fight or flight mode as somebody facing that. So I know that you have 3 tips that you wanted to share today with the listeners for what to do if this is happening to you.
Right. These are devastating allegations. However, fortunately, for the most part, they don't start to come out of the blue. The accused parent generally has some kind of forewarning something's up. They may be cut off from before parental alienation is set in to devastate or decimate any kind of contact whatsoever.
Yeah.
All once they can't see the child or they have no contact with the child, or the other spouse makes an allegation, or somehow they get wind
Yeah.
and they become almost paralyzed. What you don't know is that you have a brief window of opportunity to start decimating or trying to undermine these allegations with the truth. So the first thing you have to do, though, is prioritize. Prioritize your goals, because obviously, if this becomes a criminal case, you go to jail, or if you take a plea bargain, you're going to end up on a child sex offenders registry. It's going to have devastating implications on your life.
Wow.
If you go to jail, forget having a relationship with your child later on, or a relationship with anything.
Right.
If you end up taking a plea deal, but don't go to jail, that's one thing. Because if you go to the jail, you're the lowest ring of the totem pole. You're going to be assaulted by other inmates and other things. But if you take a deal in which there is some kind of sexual charge involved, and sometimes even if it isn't on plea down, you may be required to be on the sex offender registry, which means you're fully broadcasted to the community where you're living, what you've allegedly have done, what you've been pleaded guilty of doing. You may have to notify your neighbors. The local law enforcement will notify your neighbors. You
Yeah.
can't live generally within so many feet of a child, a daycare center, school.
Wow.
So you may sometimes end up living under a bridge. Devastation, devastation. Let's not even talk about your reputation in your community if you're dealing with it.
So
So,
in terms of priorities, because obviously if it does come out of the blue that you're just suddenly charged, priorities aren't an issue. Like, you know, that's the thing that you have to deal with. So where might it be, you might get caught, I imagine, in priorities where you're already involved in a child custody situation, for instance, or in divorce and working out the alimony, working out the visitation schedule.
the
So,
criminal case takes paramount
yeah,
importance, because even if you're in the middle of working out custody, you're not going to get any if there's an allegation of child sex abuse or any
right.
kind of child abuse against you, what's going on. If you're trying to work out other issues, it's still going to divert your attention from what's most important, which is
Right.
the destruction of the allegations so that the criminal case goes away. So you need to be contacting and hiring an experienced criminal defense attorney and make sure that that criminal defense attorney has experience dealing with child abuse issues. Also, don't fall into the lull of saying, if I do nothing, maybe it'll just go away.
Right.
It's not going to go away. If it gets to the point where the police are investigating, it's seldom going to go away. And if they're investigating, you got to do whatever is necessary to ensure that it goes away. So
So you want to
how do you
make
do
sure
that
that your
quickly? One,
lawyer, you want to make sure that your lawyer understands that this element is going to take now complete precedence over everything. In other words, you would advise people to drop whatever else you're doing and put all of your resources towards this. Am I right about that?
That is correct, simply
Yeah.
because of but you also have to let the attorneys know you may not have the same attorney representing you in the
Ah,
criminal
right.
or in
Okay.
a divorce case. So you've got to make sure the attorneys know and that the civil attorney or your attorney representing you in your divorce case or in your state agency, social service agency's case, if one
Right.
is brought, understands that they're not to do anything unless they clear it with your criminal defense attorney. You do not want to
Okay.
inadvertently do something or say something in those other cases that will compromise your position in your criminal case.
And this is a really interesting point that we maybe it's obvious to you, but you probably need a different kind of lawyer. Your lawyer might tell you that, but if you're being charged with a criminal offense and you're already working with a lawyer in your divorce, you probably need now another lawyer who specializes in this kind of criminal case. Am I right about that?
But yes, particularly in recent years, in the last few decades, lawyers have gone more and more towards specialties, not unlike the medical profession where we see everyone's board certified. Where I practice generally, my practice is located in Florida. We have bar board certifications by the state of Florida Bar Association in about 30 different specialties. So the
Right.
old day of being able to go to the attorney that can represent you in everything is long gone, particularly when you're
Okay.
dealing with these kinds of important issues.
Okay. So point number one, make sure that you are getting the right kind of attorney and pause your civil case, your divorce or custody case with clear instructions to your lawyer that nothing should happen on that end that's not being cleared because it could have implications with the criminal case. And that's the thing that needs all of your attention until it gets cleared up.
That's correct.
Okay, so I guess that this prioritization is issue number one. What's the second of your three tips?
The second of my three tips, at least dealing with the beginning of allegations, is do not take a passive position. Oftentimes, people will say, some attorneys will say, particularly if it's in the beginning of the allegations development, well, let's just sit back and see what happens. We may not have to do anything, and we don't want to stir the pot up. Unfortunately, that may or may not be the case, depending upon how good the investigating agency is. So I would rather take my own fate in my own hands and try to make sure I understand what they're looking for and what they need, which we gets to my second point, which is confirmatory bias versus alternative hypothesis. What we often see with investigating agencies, whether they're police oriented, state social service oriented, is that they are looking for evidence that will confirm the allegation.
Right,
So they will have a tendency not to evaluate or weigh or take into weigh in their considerations evidence which may not substantiate or evidence which may contradict the allegation. So that's why it's important to be able to inject other alternative hypotheses, even though they may be simple. For instance, I had a case once where it was a burning case where my client had a 3-year-old child, had just moved into a new residence. The garage had a hot water heater that was connected to a sink directly to a sink in the garage. What my client did not know that the prior resident had jacked up the heating element in that hot water tank so that the water came out scalding. His 3-year-old was an active climber, climbed up in the sink, inadvertently turned on the water, scalded his feet and his hands. He was barefoot. So it looked like he had been dipped into
ah,
scalding water on an abusive fashion. My clients rushed him to the hospital. Doctors called the state social service agency. So what they say, we didn't do it. This was what happened. So what do? Is in that case, you've got a potential alternative explanation that they're ignoring. I hired a biomedical engineer from the professor from the University of Miami who said, build a exact replica of the sink, put it out in the yard, let the 3-year-old free and see what he does with it. And we filmed him. He climbed up on the sink, just lickety split.
yeah,
Sent it to the prosecutors who were looking at the tape, and the prosecutor, who fortunately had active young sons himself, said, explains it to me. We're not going to proceed with criminal charges. You've explained it with an alternative hypothesis.
right.
So sometimes by acting rather than taking a passive role, you can avoid criminal prosecution or derail it.
Great. So you're looking for some explanation for what the child may have related in cases where it really happens. Sometimes there's just an adult who's fabricating the whole story. But sometimes these kind
Correct.
of situations come from something that the child has said, which has been either exaggerated or taken out of context or, misconstrued in some way. So you're looking to find, uh, well, the real explanation, actually. You're not making up other things, but you want to inject that as a realistic hypothesis of what actually happened.
Correct. In case another, so the next step that I think people need to do that they may not be doing is doing what I call preparing what I call the comprehensive timeline.
Okay.
What does that mean? That means sitting down and charting out in a chronological fashion date and what happened and who witnessed it. All the important factors in your case. For instance, if you have a parental alienation case, obviously we know what the bookends are for that. Bookends are a great relationship beforehand, terrible relationship now, but no explanation for it.
Right.
But what you need to do is start documenting it with what timeline, what we were doing, when did it occur, when did these things start happening? Because what you're doing then is you're preparing for your criminal defense attorney motive and explanation. For instance, when we're dealing with teenagers, we're looking for the motive to lie, but we're also looking for suggestibility issues because we know that all children, all adults are suggestible. Parental alienation creates what I call a negative environment or negative belief system in the environment about dad or mom, the alienated or targeted parent. You need to start documenting what that is. Now, you can start doing that before you see any attorney, but what I always advise people to do is to write at the top of each page, attorney-client privilege, attorney work product, because those are just two evidentiary objections to keep that stuff from coming out in the course of a case or in the course of a criminal case. Now,
Sorry, say that again. What do you advise people to write on their document?
I always tell them on anything that you produce that you give to your attorney should always have on the top of the page these words: attorney-client privilege. The second set of words is attorney work product. Attorney-client privilege means this is a communication. Attorney work product. Attorney work product. Now, let me explain the difference. Attorney-client privilege means that this is a confidential privileged communication between me and my attorney that is covered, that's given protection, at least in the state under the law. Attorney work product in a civil case is important because the other party doesn't get to see that, and the judge may get to look at it first, but it slows down the process of development. Because in a civil case, I might say, have you ever created any calendars, timelines, or that type of thing? Well, I want to make sure that before I give that up as the attorney representing the accused, that it's at least protected so that the judge would be required to look at it first before it would be given up.
Great.
So again, these are just protections, potential protections for clients.
Great.
I think clients need to be understanding what are the base rates for normal behaviors. We're dealing with, in terms of sex abuse allegations, there are things that occur, there are medical findings that may be existent in children who have been abused, but also occur in children who have not been abused. In other words, they're not specifically diagnostic of abuse. And you're going, why? Why is that important? Because there are far more children who've not been abused than there have been children that have been sexually abused. And therefore, if you see a sign that could be both, either way, you can't tell whether that's
Right.
that under supports the allegation.
Right.
Same thing for behaviors. We used at one point in time, and I've been doing this since the 1980s. At one point in time, masturbatory behaviors in young children were considered to be a sign of sexual stimulation from
Okay.
some other sort, rather than being considered a normal part of child behaviors. We do not have. The point is, how do you tell what's abnormal unless
Right.
you know what's normal?
Right.
So baseline behaviors are important. That's
Right.
important when, particularly if you can establish that the accusing spouse is what I call hypervigilant and overreactive. In other words, the child comes home from a visit, 3 years old, 2.5 years old, has a bath, says, Daddy, Daddy hurts when Daddy touches me. But Dad's bathing the child during his time. He's changing the child's diapers if she's still in diapers. So he's maybe having contact in that area of her body that's the child's complaining about, but it's all appropriate and it's all contextual,
Right.
appropriate. So we have to
Let
be able to discern
Yeah, I
those
wanted to
things.
say, let's just be clear that you and I are both very much in favor of everything that parents could do to protect children from actually being abused. So we're not looking for ways to avoid, you know, or to limit the ability of parents to say, something is not right here. I'm worried. I want to protect my child. Like that, let that I hope it goes without saying that everything we're talking about here is about protecting children, but we also have to protect children from, as you said, an overreactive or a hypervigilant situation that gets blown out of proportion, where someone would imagine that the father could be perpetrating kind of sexual crimes against their child when that really is not happening. And it's very important that
No,
that
I
we
agree. I
have these
mean,
conversations to develop more sensitivity and more discernment around these topics.
I'm in full agreement. There's no question children are abused. But just like you've said, when the net is cast as wide as it is, and it is, we're going to be scooping into that net of accusations. Sometimes people who are innocent, people who have not been abusive. And that would be to have it come out with a verdict or a finding by a judge somewhere that this parent was abusive or the child was abused would be devastating, have a devastating negative impact on both the child and the parent for the
Absolutely.
rest of their
I'm
life.
just I'm just thinking now that what we're talking about here has a similar ramifications to that whole issue of what they used to, maybe they still call it shaken baby syndrome, where so many parents have been accused by the state of killing their child or severely brain damaging their child. When I know, at least because I'm from Canada, was a very big story here about a chief pathologist who had testified in hundreds of cases and who turned out to be completely discredited. And lots of parents were in jail after the tragedy of losing a child. So those things happen too, and it's a different kind of injustice, but all injustice needs to be illuminated so that we can move forward.
Absolutely. But again, when the system is, as I say in my book, what happens in these kinds of child abuse allegations is for prosecution agencies, for the most part, these are no lose situations. What do I mean by that? If they prosecute a case and they lose, they can say those damn criminal defense attorneys, perpetrator off, again, it's not our fault. If they prosecute and win, they can say we're doing our job, we're putting perverts away. So how, I
Right.
mean, if they get their teeth in the case and go with it, Katie bar the door, you better be ready to,
Yeah.
mortgage your house to whatever is necessary to keep yourself out
Yeah.
of jail. If the
Well,
state social service agency gets it, if they get their paws into it and they make it an allegation, they're then concerned about civil ramifications to them. They get sued later for making a false allegation, not doing their job appropriately. So
right.
that's their motivation.
It's complicated, huh? You have a fantastic resource on your website that I want to point our listeners to. It is uh, a survival guide about dealing with false allegations, and the listeners can get that from your website, which is cjamisonlaw.com. Am I right? Jamieson is Jamieson, cjamisonlaw.com.
That is correct. And C is the capital C is in Charles.
Right. And in addition to that false allegations survival guide, you have a piece about parental alienation freely available on your website as well.
Right. It's free to download by anyone who visits our website. We also provide consultation services for individuals who are interested, so they don't have to be in Florida, and to both attorneys and to individuals.
Oh, that's
So
fantastic
again,
to know. Fantastic. I encourage anybody who may be finding themselves in this kind of hot water to reach out to you for whatever advice and direction you could offer, even if you're not in the state of Florida. That's really interesting to know. Um, so what can I say? Thank you so much for being here. This is a conversation that could go on, I think, for hours because you have so much wisdom to share. But we'll catch up again another time. And in the meantime, I'm going to absolutely put the link to your website in the show notes so that anybody who's interested can find you there.
I thank you for the opportunity, and I want to acknowledge the great work that you're doing in this area also.
Thank you very much.